I'm Jim Knight, co-founder of the Instructional Coaching Group, and you're listening to Coaching Conversations, where I talk with coaching experts from around the world so that all of us can learn better ways to make an unmistakably positive impact on the people around us. Well, I'm very excited to be here. I'm with three people. Two I know really well. One I'm getting to know really well today. Trista and Rachel I've talked with, and Rachel and I have presented in at least three continents. Trista and I have presented in TLC. You've come to TLC. Rachel's been to TLC, but we've worked around the world. Jasen, I've seen you on social media, and it's great. I read your book, so I'm really excited to have you here. And we're here to talk about your book about coaching with purpose. I just want to welcome you all and say thank you. It's so great to get the three of you together to talk about this wonderful book. So thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I wanted to start with a kind of, I always think a book always has kind of an origin story. So what would you say is the origin story of this book? And maybe I'll start with you, Rachel. And how did this, from your perspective, how did this book come to be?
I guess it was a germ of an idea for quite a long time, that there was a book in us, and who the us was perhaps took a little bit of time to resolve. But it comes to be because we are all really strong advocates for coaching, and we wanted to contribute to the knowledge base available to others about coaching. But we also wanted it to be something which drew heavily on our experiences and multiple other experiences, so that it was really truthful and honest and authentic, and that could have a range of values. Different readers will pick it up and take something away from it. So it comes with good intention. It comes from good intention. And I guess the first thing to add to that is that it also really represents the work of a community called the Collective Ed community. So the Collective Ed community being one which I established when I was working at Leeds Beckett University as Professor of Teacher Education, which was a centre for coaching, mentoring, professional learning in education, and thinking about how that can be developed and supported, but also how it can be critiqued. So we don't just take things on face value, and we don't just follow trends and fads. We were very keen that we had a very scholarly, thoughtful, carefully constructed representation of the work of many people over time. So it came to be with those good intentions, and we had all met in various different ways, online and in person, and we decided we were a team that could bring it together and bring other people with us to help them to contribute.
Trista, how about your take?
I love this question because it's fun to go back and what was our origin story? Because we've been really working collaboratively for a long time. So 3 years, or over 3 years, the book took us. So it's nice to think back, how did this come about? From my perspective, I had the opportunity to meet Rachel online. We first met not in person, but in conversation online, and then started doing some work together and presentations and thinking together around coaching. And she was the external examiner on my PhD defense. So knowing that it was focused around coaching. So I know that we started really to unpack what coaching and education meant, what's the research behind it, and had some really rich conversations through that. And then when Collective Ed came into existence, I was really thrilled to be part of that community. And that's where I met Jasen, through the Collective Ed community. We were fellows together, and often had side conversations after the discussions, and really wanted to continue to think about what does it actually mean when we talk about coaching and education? What's the research around this? What is the practice? Why is it working for us? Why? And then the book, I think, came out of this idea, especially for me, a need to have a book that would support the work I'm doing in my course. I teach a course on mentoring and coaching for grad students at the University of Ottawa. And it's the book I've always wanted to be able to use and couldn't find, because I use pieces of a lot of different work. So that was the driving feature for me, and to be part of a community of writers made it really, really valuable as an experience.
I love that. Jasen, what's your take on how this all came to be?
Yeah. I got to be honest. I wondered.
You do.
I wonder why Rachel and Trista asked me. I mean, to start with, I said, why me? Because of course, Rachel is a high profile regarding sort of coaching, within education. Yes, I had followed sort of Trista, sort of online. So yeah, it started with why me, but they very kindly sort of said, because of I showed up at Collective Ed, I think. So I think showing up is part of it. So I think that means that you fulfill your commitments, and I think you would know, co-authoring, so Jim, that it's not always the simplest thing to do, but it has been great and worthwhile, and an education in itself, because I wanted to do a PhD. And COVID got in the way, and I've had to accept that it's just not going to happen. So I think this was my alternative PhD, if I'm honest, because the learning over that 3 years was incredible, not just from these two, but from all of the people that we worked alongside, and just all of the research as well. So it's yeah, my alternative PhD.
Well, it's
And
wonderful. And what a great question to start with. Why me? That's probably a question we should ask ourselves before we do everything, though we have to be careful to give an honest answer. And that's the second thing is what you said about you think that 3 people writing the book means I have 1/3 of the work to do. But what I found is it takes just as much work to create a book with 3 people as it does to create one on your own. So it's a lot of work. I have a little question here I'd like to ask just to get started. And we'll go back to you, Rachel, to start. But how did you come to get involved in coaching? And then could you say a little bit more about Collective Ed? People in America may not know you as well as you're in the UK. In the UK, you're a leading voice, one of the 2 or 3 most important voices around coaching in the country. So how just say a little bit about how you got involved in the first place, and how the work at Leeds has really Leeds Beckett has kind of grown and developed since then. What you've created is really an awesome thing. So if you could say a bit about that, that'd be great.
Oh, well, thank you, Jim. I think the first thing to say is actually how I came to end my work, formal, paid, regular work in education. So I'm now a retired professor of teacher education, and that's after 35 years working in schools and universities, and with the majority of that time in somehow connected with either mentoring or coaching student teachers or experienced teachers in various different guises. So across a number of different roles, this almost feels like my life's professional work. How it first started was in my second job as a teacher. So about 4 or 5 years into being a teacher, I was very, very fortunate. I happened to be working in a school that had strong relationships with the local university, and the local university had managed to secure a grant, which they used to develop a network of people and schools where the focus was enhancing teaching thinking skills, or the kind of more metacognitive approach to learning and teaching. And what they did was they recruited a group of people, and I was one of them, who had already been engaged in a number of networks around teaching thinking skills, so had developed our practice, had gained some knowledge and insight and expertise, and were situated, embedded in schools in our daily lives, and who were working in schools where that practice wasn't uniform. It hadn't rippled out. Now, that is very rare that something like that ripples out, unless there's if you like, a directive from above that it must, and that's often not terribly helpful. But it was one of those situations where over a period of 3 years, through this research funding, a small group of us working alongside, co-constructing, I would now say, with the university, developed a model through which we were coaching other teachers, as well as learning more ourselves about teaching thinking skills, in order to start to create those ripple effects of that practice across the settings. And it was a really thoughtful, in some ways quite organic project, and it included many of the features of professional learning that I've held dear ever since and have tried to replicate in a number of different settings. And that was when I first became a coach. And actually, I guess I would look back on it now and say I was trained. I was trained using the Costa and Garmstorm model cognitive coach. I see it. It's a long time since I've thought about this, Jim. The cognitive coaching type approach to work with colleagues. And then that almost seamlessly led me to become a teacher educator, so employed by the university, that same university. And that was a nice kind of segue into then working more directly, more routinely with other teachers who were mentors and coaches, and then engaging in research around this area myself and with other colleagues. So that was my experience. So as a coach, a long time ago, 1996, 7, 8, a long time ago.
Well, Costa and Garbson that's a great starting point. You know, they won the Don Deschler Leadership Award last year, and I went to interview them. You know, I knew their work. I found their work a little tough to process in a book, though training is a lot more accessible. But as human beings, they're wonderful human beings. I met them both. I think they're both late 80s or 90s when I got together with them. But I never realized that cognitive coaching, the cognitive part, was Art Costa. And he studied Feuerstein and all these other people who talk about you can think yourself into a higher level of intelligence. Feuerstein was a big influence. And then Garmston was the coaching, and he worked with some of the leading experts in the whole area of coaching. So cognitive coaching, those two people coming together, it's really Costa's cognitive and Garmston's coaching. I never realized that. And yes, super, super wonderful beginning. And there's so many things about what they do that I think is consistent with the things like way of being and how you describe that. Trista, now, Rachel's one of the leading voices in the United Kingdom for coaching. You're Canada. You're at my alma mater, the University of Ottawa. So, and I just talked to Andy Hargraves just a couple of days ago. So I did a podcast on his new book. So how'd you come to this whole magical world of coaching?
Oh, that's just want to take a moment and think about the sense making that you shared about Garmson and Costa coming together, and like that whole idea of how when people come together, what the magic that can happen. And I think that's a lot of similarities across the work that we've been doing here, and your work too, Jim, informs a lot of what we think. And so I guess how did I come to being it was in a school base. So I was working for the Western Quebec School Board, a little small school board in the province of Quebec in Canada, English language school board that is, you know, geographically huge, but very much small in number. So we struggled to think about, well, how do we retain and grow teachers with very little resource? And so that really was the entry. So I was a teacher for a long time, and then also a vice principal. And in that role, started seeing, you know, how do we actually support professional growth? Because I was very interested in systemic change, educational change, and also thinking about instructional work. So pedagogy, like how do we continue to develop and share knowledge across a system that's really far apart from one another? And we have like expert teachers in this classroom and a new teacher here. So how are we going to make these connections and bring them together? So I think that started to be the impetus for me to think about ways to bring people together, and how does knowledge flow and how do we circulate it? And so that really was the first introduction into thinking about induction, but also growing experienced members of our community. And how can you bring those two elements together? And so I was part of the development of a teacher induction program that used mentoring and coaching as our framework to think about how do we pair people in schools and across a district to bring this way of being of how do we use the term accompaniment. So how do we accompany one another? How do we make sure we're cared for, but also we are challenged and we are encouraged to grow as we go through our career? So that was the entry point. But as I was leading that project, I kept thinking, I should probably know something about mentoring and coaching. And where do you start? Like there's so many books out there. There's so many different, like you've just mentioned cognitive coaching, Rachel, you know, which kind of coaching works for us? How do we begin? And so that was the entry point, like sifting through some of the material, the literature to build a program that really inspired me to go into doing my PhD on coaching to figure it out, because I was simultaneously still working at the school board and bringing what I was learning from the courses back. And that's sort of how I landed in this idea of pracademia, like bringing practice and academia together and making sure that it's like meaningful to the place of work and the people that I work with and that I care about. And so that really was the starting place for coaching. And then I started looking for a community and I couldn't really find it in Canada too much. So that's when I ended up connecting with, Growth Coaching International, with the Instructional Coaching Group, with Rachel and Collective Ed, and started seeing, where other people were thinking, what kind of tools and resources were they using. And then we were also building our own because we really believe that it has to be contextual. You can't just borrow a program from somewhere else, drop it in and think it's going to be successful. So what kind of structural elements can we build in that make sense for our context in this, small community in Quebec, but borrow from people that have been doing this work. So that was probably in the 90s, early 2000s, Rachel, as well. So it's, learning a lot since then. But that would be the kernel of coaching for me.
Well, I remember a lot of the people from that Western Quebec district because they came to Kansas to our institutes and went back and worked with you. And they were wonderful, wonderful. I mean, they still are wonderful human beings, of course, but it was wonderful to work with. Now, Jasen, your story involves Tonga. So I want to hear about how you got drawn. And it sounds like the Collective Ed community was a kind of a catalyst for you. But what's your story?
Yeah. I'm I said I was honest, and the three of us really are honest, with each other. There is
I think I am too. Except
you are good.
when it's going to be insulting to the other person. Somebody says, "Do you think I look good?" I'm not going to say no.
I've been like you. I mean, you're surrounded by, which I'm assuming is literature regarding coaching. I could be wrong, but I'm in the background outside. I've surrounded myself with loads of books which have influenced me. So I'm surrounded by the people whose shoulders I stand upon, and I'm gonna just show sort of this book that loads of people know, and I show this because I'm really embarrassed to say, to show people that it's the word advice. Okay, so I live in England. I live right in the middle of England in a county called Worcestershire. Okay, and the education sort of like district is called Worcestershire, and I was employed with the title of learning and teaching advisor. So as soon as I read, sort of Michael's book about the advice trap, I just thought, oh no, I was employed in the role of giving advice to people. And I've got to give a shout out because I mentioned this person, but not their name in the book, because we decided that is the way we wouldn't be too anecdotal sort of in the book. But I'm going to give a shout out to my first coach, who is called Brian Pengelly. Okay. And I had a conversation with him about saying, I've heard about this thing called coaching, and I don't really know what it is, but I know what a sports coach is, but they just tell people what to do, don't they? And he was going, well, and we toyed with this idea within the district of calling ourselves learning and teaching coaches, but it just didn't sit. And so, but what I realized through working with, sort of with these guys here and by reading is that I actually was, Jim, an instructional coach, but I didn't know it. And so I think the reason why I say that is, without being disrespectful, is I was allowed to be the person I wished to be to support others. So predominantly my role was to work in schools that were, let's put it euphemistically, under the microscope. So they were either failing or they were close to being failing due to the system in which schools are judged within England. And so disproportionately, I worked with people who were literally couldn't see the wood for the trees and were on their knees, and they wouldn't allow you in their room unless you were useful. And that's where I learned that I wasn't trained to be a coach, but I luckily had the coaching way of being that worked with people who were really struggling. So that's my introduction, Jim.
I love it. That's great. And we want to hear more about your upcoming travels and what you're going to be doing. So one thing I'm wondering about is the title. The title, I'm doing this from memory now, but the title is Coaching with Purpose. Is that exact? There you go. I'm still waiting for my copy, just so you know. But anyway, Coaching with Purpose. Tell me, Rachel, why did you pick that title? Where did the title come from? Why do you think the title is important?
So there's a title and then a subtitle. So it's Coaching with Purpose, and then Learning Encounters for Educational Change. And there are lots of books on coaching, and we've read many of them. And we could have written a variety of types of books on coaching, but as we talked and worked together, these themes, the purpose theme, the notion of a learning encounter, and the relationship between coaching and educational change became so significant. So I'll say something about learning encounters first, I think, because that's perhaps something which doesn't often appear on the cover of a book. So we landed on this idea of learning encounters as another way of conceptualizing coaching, but not just coaching. And we played with it, quite liked the way it slipped off the tongue, if you like. We thought it sounded and looked quite neat, but we wanted to be sure that it really worked. So we were thinking, what does it mean to have an encounter? And it might be an encounter with a person, or an encounter with a place, or an idea, or it might be encountering your emotional response to something, the challenge you face, or the jubilation and joy you experience when something works. But it also might be encountering those forms of practice that are unfamiliar to you, either because they're coming in as new ideas, or because actually they are quite familiar to people in other areas of the world, but that we don't often draw upon in our own contexts. So we like this idea of encountering people, places, ideas, emotions, and practice, because we felt that actually in really, really good coaching situations, that is what you do. You encounter things. We also thought about encounters as they are very authentic. They're not formulaic. They're not necessarily, well, they're not pre-programmed. They're situational or contextual. They are relational. And even if all it does is maybe not always a relationship with another person, an encounter, but it makes you think again about yourself as a practitioner, yourself as a thinker, yourself as an actor in a space, what you are able to achieve in that space. So there is a relational component as well. And they are potentially significant encounters. We've all had encounters in our lives that have turned out to be really significant, but you wouldn't always know that in the moment. Often the significance comes later down the line. At the beginning, you might be quite tentative about the encounter that you are offered, or that you find yourself in the midst of. And it might have an immediate feedback loop, but often it's the potential that encounter creates that makes the difference further down the line. So we like this idea of learning encounters because partly we like the idea of coaching as a form of encounter. And then if we think about it as a learning mode, so coaching to enable and encourage learning, we like the idea of defining it as a place where you might become more open to new ideas, not just have them dumped on you from elsewhere, but actually become more open to new ideas, and therefore perhaps seek others out. We liked thinking about coaching as a learning encounter as a place, a space, a time, and a conversation in which you might connect knowledge and experience. So the encounter is between those two things. And we also thought about, well, what might start to be the result of some of these encounters. And for example, Jasen talked about those teachers who might be struggling at a particular time in a particular place. And they're struggling often because the challenges that they face are high level challenges. But perhaps a really good learning encounter is the sort that over time allows you to feel more confident with some of those challenges that you are undoubtedly going to face in a professional context like ours. And particularly in coaching and in education, it is all about the relationships that you have with other people, because other people matter. That's what we're doing in education. We're not creating robots, we're creating, creating is perhaps the wrong word, but it's about human beings, it's about people. And therefore, our ability to remain curious about others is also something that is stimulated by really powerful learning encounters. So that's explored a little bit in the book. And it isn't to take away from the terminology that we more typically use about coaching, but it's perhaps to just enrich our thinking about what coaching might bring into these educational spaces. So that's where the learning encounters came from. I think Jason's going to talk about purpose, where that bit
Yeah,
came from.
I wanted to respond to that really quickly though, because it strikes me that a learning encounter, as you're describing it, is not just hearing new ideas. It's a co-construction to some extent, and it involves transfer and internalizing and making it a part of who you are. It's not just something that comes and goes like a workshop, where the learning encounter, often a catalyst for it is an opportunity or a challenge a person's facing, and then they have this chance to say, how do these ideas come together? And it's that combination of ideas and real life activity that I think it reminds me a bit of the time to think idea of Nancy Klein's, but that learning encounter is very cool. But what about the purpose part, Jason? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you know, Jim, but my studies and background is linguists and linguistics. So I do ponder over words more than many. And we had we didn't have an argument over this, but we had great discussion over the choice of words. So what I'm going to say is that I really took it upon myself to explore the concept of purpose historically, not just in education, and it really is open to lots of interpretation, and therefore in education and even in coaching, perhaps misinterpretation, or even skepticism of, who cares about purpose?
Right.
It's all about making progress, isn't it? If I'm being devil's advocate. So I was most interested in exploring purpose through the lens of a sense of purpose, and for me that started with reading lots of literature about things, books and people that quite philosophical, really, that referred to the big questions of what is your purpose in life, what gets you out of bed in the morning, and then I realized that actually a sense of purpose was very much, through my reading and through my synthesis, it was about how your values shape your sense of purpose. The things that you really care about, the things that really do have meaning for you, and the things that are valuable. And then I realized as a linguist that that the prefix "val," in values, means strong and worthwhile. And so when you think of words like values, I thought, hey, do you know what? If our values shape our sense of purpose, what gets us up in the morning, a powerful reason, a powerful reason, something that gives us, there's loads of metaphors here, so I have to apologize for like mixed metaphors, but something that gives you wind in your sails, something that gives you that gives you grip to the tires, gives you traction, gives you a real sense of this is worthwhile. And therefore you realize, again, you can see what I've poured over Mike, of Michael's books of, a worthy goal. I thought that guy is shrewd. He chooses his words carefully, because actually a worthy goal is a powerful, in my interpretation, a powerful reason that helps you to construct, or in coaching, co-construct a powerful goal. And then you have a pathway towards it. And perhaps a vision and preferred future is your ultimate goal. I mean, goals, you can frame that in lots of different ways. But but yeah, that was that. So for me, a sense of purpose is valuable. It's a valuable conversation. And what I would say is that Rachel or Trista, they would speak to purposes, themes that that we observed and that we sort of found in our, because this book is a study, this book followed a research methodology and had ethical approval, so it was. So I refer to it as my alternative PhD, but I don't know. Rachel or sort of Trista, they'll speak to the purposes, the thematic purposes, I'm sure.
Yeah, if I can, I'll just say I think one of the things that happens when you write a book is you imagine it in your head long before it exists, and then particularly if you're after a publisher, you have to convince them that they may want to publish a book that doesn't exist in order to motivate yourself to get started. So we inevitably wrote a draft of chapters for a book called Coaching with Purpose. I think it was always called Coaching with Purpose. And we had imagined what these chapters might look like around the purposes that people used coaching for in different educational settings. And then it got accepted as a book, and thank goodness. The flexibility of the publisher meant that all the chapter headings could change, because what we wanted to actually do was explore what people really said they used coaching for and could see the point of coaching for in a variety of educational settings, and then thematically illustrate those from our case studies. So we have, in section 3 of the book, we talk about coaching having a number of different purposes, and then each chapter draws on a number of case studies. And the one that we're often very familiar with is enhancing teaching and learning. So there's a segment of the book about that. There's the slightly broader purpose of enabling and empowering others. As educators, we all would want to be able to claim we do that, but there's not always the mechanism and the tools at our disposal to be fully sure that we are enabling and empowering others. So we talk about coaching as one of those tools. We talk about coaching as having the purpose to shape cultures. So those people who work and want to create organizations, institutions where there is a particular cultural resonance, a sense of identity and a way of being together in that organization. Coaching can help to create that. Of sustaining change over time, because we know that school improvement, school change, dips and troughs all the time, peaks and troughs rather all the time. So sustaining change over time. And we also talked about it being obviously a space in which purposeful conversation happens, but the real value of that in things like curriculum development, those purposeful conversations. And we also thought about coaching as drawing on our case studies as a way in which it becomes possible to enact social justice and create greater equity. And that included around decoloniality. So those were the purposes that emerged from our work with our contributors that we then drew together in the chapters. So it helped that we had started with a sense of purpose, but then explored what others saw coaching as having a purpose for. So yeah, purpose is key.
It's expanding. This discussion's expanding my thinking about purpose. And Trista, I'm wondering on your take on the title. What's your ideas about coaching with purpose?
Well, I mean, going back to the discussion around the title, we really discussed coaching with purpose, coaching for a purpose, coaching with purpose for a purpose. How do you play around with these senses? And I think when we were thinking about these learning encounters, these moments, so either coaching helps support or provide a learning encounter, but also can there's some sort of movement. Like we're going somewhere. There's a purpose to the coaching that we're trying to do. Why do school boards join and develop coaching programs? They want something to happen. So there is a purpose. So, and the purpose can be different. So we really wanted to respect that there are different entry points and even individuals. So individual coaches, individual coachees, systems, we all have different values that drive our sense of purpose and where we want to go. But there is some sort of change that's happening. And we're hoping it's like a purposeful progress, that it's positive, that we're moving forward collectively, like the sense of collective momentum. And so we really wanted to consider that in the title as well. That's the educational change component in our title. It's because we know that there are lots of books out there about the how-to, the nuts and bolts about coaching, but we also wanted to be part of the conversation that we think is really valuable that's happening right now in the field, where people are looking at context, they're looking at culture, so coaching cultures, and then they're looking at change. And I know you've written some things as well around, coaching situated within educational change. So what do we know about change, and what do we know about educational change specifically? So what happens in schools and what happens with individuals? So we spent a lot of time in the book, especially the last section of the book, unpacking the theories, like the individual theories of change. So what happens within an individual? So we looked at it across the level of the person that we're coaching, the coachee, is going through a process of change, working alongside their coach. So over time, something's happening, they're understanding their behaviors, maybe their attitudes, that's changing over time, hopefully in a positive and purposeful way, with the support of the coach. So there's the individual change process. There's also the individual change process for a coach. So when I first started coaching, I would say I was less than mediocre, perhaps even, like you're just learning how to do it. So you have a way of being that's really helpful, but there are skills that you can develop and expertise that you can get more competent and more confident in your coaching. And I think your coaching improves. So as the coach grows, that also is a change process. And it's actually, for me, one of the exciting parts about working with experienced teachers is when they start learning to coach, it gives another lens to their work. So now they're working with adults in their building, not just they teach the children, it's not they work with the students, but they also are working with colleagues. And that just gives another way to grow and to stretch. So there's the individual coachee and the coach part that's happening, but systems are also dealing with change. So when you're implementing and trying to sustain programs, you're going through a change process. So what does that look like? And when you're using coaching, how is the coaching program evolving and adapting and changing over time? And then finally, thinking about it from the use of a coaching program, and Rachel talked about it earlier, using coaching to support another initiative. So you want to do more metacognition in mathematics, for example, as she was talking about. How do you use coaching to support that? Or if there's a big reform or there's something coming down from the system. So coaching is a great tool, but how do you embed that purposeful progress? And so in the back end of the book, we really unpack we called it the 5 A's. So our way of thinking about educational change, these dynamic changes. So we wanted it to be a thinking tool for people who maybe have coaching programs or are coaches or working in the space of developing a coaching program, to think about where are we along this process. And we don't think of it as an event, changes over time. So where are we? What kinds of steps can we make to move more purposely forward, and think about the initiatives that we're building and developing together, and how do we grow? So that was our purpose behind that.
It's really rich. I really am enjoying the conversation, and it's pushing my thinking about purpose, because I've tended to say we just want to have an unmistakably positive impact on the learning and achievement and engagement of kids, and so this is broadening it out. What's my purpose? What's the purpose of the teacher? What's the moral purpose behind it? All those things. So I love it. So we have one last question. We've got about 10 minutes, just so you know. So the last question is, you mentioned, Trista, that when I mentioned how Costa and Garbson influenced each other, you said that you learned a lot from this. So what did you learn in writing the book?
I learned, and I knew, but learned even more, the depth of the field. And really how the connective elements across the theory, the history of coaching. So it's through many disciplines. And so we often think of, at least I do, in more of a silo approach in education, and like, this is coaching in education. But what we can learn from exploring what's happened in the business world, what happens in health professions, and seeing coaching across these different fields and the depth, psychology. So going back, like looking at some of the theoretical underpinnings that we discuss, is really helpful to understand the why of certain strategies. Why do I use a strategy that seems to really speak to me? It's probably because I'm thinking in this lens. So if it's like having sort of a positive psychology approach, and I like solution-focused approaches, well, that makes sense that I use a scaling approach because that works for me. That and the strength-based thinking or the characters and character traits that we're driving the conversation. So I love like learning more about the background that informs the tools that we often use and we see working, that we hear about. And I love learning from the case study participants all the different ways that they've entered coaching and how they've adapted it in their context, and that it can work in so many different ways, coaching, but there are similarities in coherence. So it is a really rich field and there is a complexity to it, but there's a coherence that you can start seeing across all of the people working in this space. And that's important because sometimes it just feels a little bit disconnected. So that I really learned from pulling that together with my colleagues.
No, that's a great. I'll come back to that at the end because you gave me a question to answer, so I'm going to answer that too. Jason, what did you learn from writing this book?
Yeah, I'm gonna circle back to you mentioning Tonga, okay? And as these two know, I'm a real talker. Luckily, I'm a concise writer, and so I have been prepped. And I'm not going to say warned. I have been prepped, so I'll be concise as I can be. I got a great gig, okay, great gig. So I have been in education in various roles for over 30 years in primary education, so elementary, so as said in America. And so I've got a great gig. I'm an education consultant working in the Kingdom of Tonga to co-construct the primary school curriculum for English language. It's a huge responsibility, okay? Huge responsibility. And I constantly question, am I really doing this right? Am I really being helpful? I'm told by my colleagues that I am, but this is really interesting. It is authentic partnership principles. So whilst working in Tonga, was writing the book with my colleagues here, and I was not employed as a coach, and I was employed as an education consultant. But when coaching is something you research and you're an accredited coach and it is your way of being, do you know what? That's how you're going to show up. And for me, Jim, and this isn't the kind of to embarrass you, or it's the partnership principles. Whenever I heard that expression, I always associate that. I always attribute that to you. And for me, working in Tonga, what I understood and was made very clear to me by my colleagues was, Jason, you're not Tongan. You don't understand how we think, but you try. Okay, you try. And I'd like to talk more to this, but I'm going to just finish with this and say, I learned 2 words in Tongan, and the first, which have really made a difference to my learning in this book and my way of thinking about coaching in education. There is a word in Tongan called va, and it means the space between us, not the space beyond. And it is really important. It is such an important word in Tongan society to create the space between us. And then there's an expression called tawiva, which means taking care of the space. It is respectful. It is valuable, and it is not always in agreement. There is discussion. There is interthinking. There is co-construction. But that whole idea of being in Tonga and working with people who I've really tried to understand how they think. And this is a shout out to Chris Monroe, who helped me with this phrase of, I've always tried to be in service of their thinking, their purpose, and their progress. And so you can see where Trista and I have used now freely purposeful progress, through this thinking together. So I'm going to stop there, because I could go on and say that, yeah, it's been a real learning. It's been a real piece of learning.
Well, I love that. I love that very much. That's great. And as far as the partnership principles, thanks for the kind words, but those principles were everybody else is writing. People like Rianne Eisler and Peter Block and Paulo Freire way back in the read in the 70s. It's a collection. It's all I did was take everyone else's ideas and collect them together and make them accessible. I studied them, but I did research on it. But it's really the work of other people. This is the way it goes. Rachel, we're going to give you the last word on this, and then I'll just say what I loved about the book. That's how we're going to sum up. What's your take on what you learned writing the book?
Well, one of the things I learned was that you can often find lines of thinking around through decades of work. So having drawn upon work that first began for me in the 1990s, but took me right up to 2024, 25, it was, and Trista used the word coherence, and coaching created a coherence across a whole range of pieces of work. And I realized in writing the book that experience is not unique. It's something which many educators have too. So although their work is often quite challenging, sometimes a bit disparate, they're often at the beck and call of others, coaching is something which speaks to them as human beings, as individuals, as educators, which often sustains them across different practices and different places. And that was a really lovely thing to discover, actually, that we can create this way of being an educator, which is related to being and thinking about coaching. So it helped me to think about coaching afresh, and certainly to consolidate my understanding of it as a way of knowing, not just a way of being, but through coaching, we can know each other as colleagues, as educators, and also begin to know our students differently and our communities differently, because we have conversations that emerge authentically in the context, in the place and the time, about learning and teaching, or about leadership, or about the social conditions in which we find ourselves in. It allows us to know about practice. And I think that as educators, as teachers, it is our obligation to continue to learn about practice and how we can enhance our own practice and support others. And coaching, I think the book helped me really recognize that. And also to think about practice as an intellectual form. It is a craft. There are certainly skills that you can acquire over time, and you can rehearse them and you can get better at them. But in education, it is a form of scholarship as well. It doesn't matter how new you are in the role in education. It doesn't matter how scared you might be of the word scholarship or intellectual or academic. It is a scholarly practice. And I think coaching helps us to create that practice in a place which is supported and held in the space between us, as Jasen described there. And also it becomes a place and a way of knowing about how education systems work. And if we're going to work well in them, whatever role we take, we have to understand them as systems. And coaching can become a place in which we know how education systems work and what our potential is within them. So it really helped me consolidate decades of work and thinking about coaching, and to confirm for me that when done well, it is extraordinarily powerful. And the only other thing I would add to this is one of the subheadings in the book, which really emerged from our thinking with our colleagues in other contexts through their case studies and their reflections, was the notion that in coaching, there are outcomes, there is change. Change does happen to the individual and to the organizations over time. But sometimes those changes are largely unseen. They're not what's looked for, but they're there. So they are often unseen. They can be felt and they can be explored, but we perhaps have to bring them out, make them more visible. They can be a bit unbidden. So they're not necessarily outcomes we went out to achieve, but they are there. And then we relate those to our purpose and our values, and we recognize how significant they can be, but also that they are unique. So one of the wonderful things about the coaching world is that we are always creating that unique quality that we hope we have as humans and that we bring into the settings that we work in.
So I'll sum up quickly. You sent me the question, a question for Jim. You said you've written lots of coaching books and you wrote the foreword. can you share what stood out for you in our book? So I want to tell you about my experience with the book because I had a early version of it before it went out, and I'm honored to have been asked to write the foreword. I don't want to know how many people turned you down before I finally said yes, but I'm grateful to have the chance. But I thought I'll just sit down this afternoon and I'll read this book and then I'll pump out the forward. I'll just go through it really quickly. And when I sat down with the book, I realized this is not a book you skim in an afternoon and write a forward for. It's a substantial contribution. And we're in a time where there are a lot of what the AI people call deep fakes, where people are using the word coaching and instructional coaching, and those using it have never been coaches, and they're divorced from the whole tradition of coaching. So your book, to me, is an answer to that kind of tendency to offer uh, a superficial understanding of coaching that isn't connected to the traditions of coaching and what we've learned through decades of work on coaching. Plus, there's so much about the four components of the book that add depth, and it's almost like a rich anthology. It's not really a narrative to move through. It's like I want to spend a lot of time thinking, oh, what are the concepts that are at the heart of coaching? Or I want to read cases of personal experiences. And so there wasn't one thing I loved about the book. What I loved about the book is the fact that it's not the kind of book that there's one thing. It's a rich anthology that's deep, accessible, entertaining, but really important in terms of defining what coaching is and within the tradition of coaching. That's what I loved about it. It took me a long time to write the foreword because there's so much about it. So that's what I saw. Thank you all so much. I'm so grateful. I hope I get to meet you all again really quickly. It's been a while. Jason, welcome to Tonga anytime and say hi. So we'll do that. And then Trista, Ottawa is one of my all-time favorite cities. I loved living there. So I have to get back. I absolutely love Ottawa. To me, it's the perfect place. It's a small town feel that has spectacular galleries and music coming through. So I love it. It's international center and humane. And then I'm also deep inside, my family comes from England, so I have a great connection with England. So I'd love to see you all over there too. Thank you all so much.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
And thank you for your words, Jim.
Yeah,
cheers.
they kind.